I strongly suspect that everybody works. I'm not absolutely sure about that. And I also think that the work that everybody does makes an economic and social contribution. For example, there's housework, there's raising children, there's cooking, there's cleaning and all that kind of thing. And a lot of the time these things could in theory be paid, and people do also do them as jobs, such as childminding, teaching and cleaning houses. So that does exist, and that kind of work makes an economic and social contribution. You don't want to have a world where children are not looked after, and from the point of view of money, that would not be a good thing, because nobody would live long enough to get paid work, although that's obviously not the point. However, I do think it's possible to fall into what I might describe as an unemployed state of mind. What I mean by this is that if you can't find work, or you can't find a job, you can't get people to pay you, what happens is you tend to become depressed, demotivated, have negative views of what you're able to do, and sort of slip into a sort of slough of despond. And I think that this obviously is mentally unhealthy for people. People do need to do things. My personal problem is a bit hard to describe. I would put it in this way. My personal problem is not that I can't find a job. My problem is that the work that I do is hard to be paid for. I find it hard to get people to pay me for the work that I do. And I also find it hard to find work that is likely to be paid. Examples of this are, for example, I'm doing this YouTube video now, and that's a form of work in a way. And it being a Sunday, obviously it's a sin that I'm doing this. But that's what I'm doing, and I'm talking about work as opposed to rest, so it's sort of connected. Other things would be the herbalism, the teaching, making toiletries, all that sort of thing, all of which could potentially be paid, but don't get paid. And obviously I do other kinds of work as well, such as cooking, washing, doing the washing up and so forth. And I do other kinds of work in other contexts too, various kinds of voluntary work. I don't actually get paid for very many of them, and I don't particularly want to be paid for them. But the thing is, that brings me to the next issue. Unemployment is a mental health hazard, because if you're not sufficiently motivated, you have a problem that will lead to depression and so forth. But what if the only jobs you can find are jobs that are inherently immoral? For example, what if the only job you could find would be working for a company that makes torture equipment for the third world, or weapons of mass destruction, and so forth? Obviously you need to get your hands dirty to some extent, and you can sit in a sort of position of moral superiority and say all of that's too bad for me, and that's probably a dodgy thing to do. But on the whole, I think you need to risk the mental health problem associated with unemployment if the only jobs that are around you, that are available to you, are inherently immoral. So, in a sense, people need to be compensated for that. Now, what's useful work? I think an example of useful work which is looked down on a lot, and it's something that I actually would really like to do, is working down the sewers. Working down the sewers saves more lives than the whole of the NHS and all the emergency services put together, and is probably maybe the second most important job, the most important job being farming. If nobody worked down the sewers, everybody would die of cholera basically, and that would not be good. And as a result, it is really, really important work, but not work that I can actually do. Now there's also the question of specialised work, work that is a skill such as medical work, where if it's withheld, people will die. That's a bit like, suppose you were paid for first aid and nobody else could do first aid. And somebody's saying, oh, I'm not going to pay you for first aid because I'm dying, bleeding to death, having been crashed into by a car. And you say, well, I'm not going to do that because you're not going to pay me for it because you haven't got enough money. That is immoral. And to some extent, the disempowering effect of offering specially skilled work that is essential is like that. So in a way, I would prefer my work to be useless. Now when I say useless, what I'm talking about is I would prefer my work to be a form of creative work, which is thought of as purely creative. So for example, I would like to be perhaps in the Beatles, or I'd like to be Shakespeare. Because then my work is not essential in the sense that it can be exchanged for somebody else. There would be no other Shakespeare plays if Shakespeare didn't exist, but there would be other plays by Ben Jonson, which would be different, but good. And the same applies to the Beatles. If they didn't exist, then probably the Rolling Stones would have produced a load of other stuff and so on. So that kind of exchangeable situation is actually better in some ways, because you're not withholding work that's essential to someone's life, but it is definitely work that is valued. So useless work is good in some ways. The other thing is that I think that pay is compensation for the situation where you are unable to support yourself. Because you're working, you then become time poor, and it makes self-sufficiency more difficult. So, for example, I wouldn't be able to make my own bread, make my own soap. I wouldn't be able to gather food. In fact, I don't gather food really, if I had a job. And so you need money for that. But if you take that away, the fact is that if a work is worth doing, then that work is worth doing for free, because it should be worthwhile in itself and not actually something that you do for the money. Nevertheless, you need to be paid for it, because if you're not paid for it, then you haven't got enough money to live on and you'll starve and you won't be able to work anymore. So that's what I think. I don't really believe in the work ethic, although I do believe that work can be good for you. I believe that jobs that are not good shouldn't exist, and that it's better to be unemployed than to do a job that is not good. And I think that it's actually a social good not to refrain from doing harmful work. So if you like this video, please rate, comment and subscribe. If you dislike it, please tell me why so I can improve, and I'll see you tomorrow.